Thank you all for being here tonight, and thank you to the World Affairs Council for bringing me out here. I'm really delighted to be here and delighted to be here in person. We went back and forth a little about, well, whether it was going to be in person or not, but it really is a pleasure to be in person with all of you. A big thank you to Deb Pierce and to Joe Shaw in particular for all the work to put this together. And Joe, I wanted to say a particular thank you for arranging to have President Biden and Xi Jinping meet last night to kind of set up my talk. I thought that was clever. You know, it just showed good timing, good acumen, so thank you for that. The timing of the summit, it was interesting. I think we have been, for some years now, and in particular over the last several months, in a period of rapid deterioration in U.S.-China relations, entering a much more dangerous phase of international politics. As the two leaders met, there was all this commentary about whether or not we are now in a new Cold War. Both leaders went out of their way to deny that. But I would say, at the very least, we are in an acute arms race. In the last 2 months alone, we saw the launch of the Australia, UK, US nuclear submarine deal, the decision by the United States to transfer the technology for nuclear submarine propulsion for the first time since the 1950s. The most closely guarded secret in the U.S. military arsenal, which we gave to the British at the kind of real sort of start of the Cold War, and we're now giving to the Australians at the launch of. We'll come to what this is, but certainly an arms race. We saw China's test of a hypersonic glide missile, a nuclear-capable missile that can evade our defenses. We've seen tests of our ballistic missile systems. We've seen the announcement of substantial expansion plans of China's nuclear stockpile. But I would say the most important and the biggest driver of the deterioration has been the huge increase in China's naval buildup, the fastest buildup of a naval force since the United States did it after Pearl Harbor. Okay, and I think a lot of what we're going to be talking about today, Taiwan and other issues that will come up, have as their backdrop this huge buildup of the Chinese fleet. And it's a broader issue, and what I'll spend a lot of my time talking about this evening is China's return to the seas for the first time in 500 years, which is a pretty significant development in global affairs. The stakes are huge. These are the two largest economies in the world, the two largest militaries in the world. We are still a more powerful military without question, but China is a close number two at this stage, even relative to 5 or 6 or 7 years ago. There's been an extremely rapid buildup of both scale and quality of Chinese military capability. We are the two countries with global influence and global reach, and we are now in a very tense naval standoff someplace over there in the Western Pacific, and I'll come to all of that. But we are in a tense arms race already. So how did we get here? Remember, globalization was supposed to be a bulwark against these tensions. Shared global issues like climate change was supposed to be a bulwark against these tensions. And yet here we are in a very acute arms race, playing out in real time, and a technology race as well. You know how they say you go bankrupt slowly, 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 then suddenly? Well, we're suddenly there. But what I want to do tonight is spend a little more time on the slowly, slowly. How did we get here? Go back a little bit to talk about how we got here. Give us some context for what's happening, all these tests that we're seeing, all the kind of the nuclear deal and et cetera. And then we can open up to discussion and sort of talk about where we are and what the summit meant or didn't mean and what's going on with Taiwan, and there's a whole host of issues. But what I would like to do is sort of get us to where we are relatively quickly, and then leave it to you to sort of steer what's of interest to you, and we'll take the conversation whichever ways you all want to go. So what went wrong? I spent a lot of time thinking about this when I was writing this book that Joe mentioned, To Rule the Waves, which is a book about the interplay between globalization, geopolitics, and broader global issues, energy flows, climate change, oceanography, a bunch of stuff. But at core, it's a book about the relationship between globalization and geopolitics. And I reached a conclusion which surprised me and is sort of contrary to the conventional wisdom, which is that globalization has not been a bulwark against these tensions, that when you really understand what's driving globalization and China's sense of itself in relationship to that it's the critical driver of the tensions that we're now confronting, because it's the critical driver of China's return to the seas. So I'll unpack all that in a couple of moments. I'm going to spent a lot of time on U.S.-China relations, but we're not alone out there in the world. There's the Indians and the Russians and the Japanese and the Koreans and the Germans and the Brits and the French and an awful lot of other countries who are trying to figure out what's happening in the world, trying to relate to these shifting sort of tectonic plates of U.S.-China relations, who are part of this arms race in the Western Pacific, who are part of the rearticulation of globalization. So I'll concentrate on U.S.-China, but there is this much wider cast of characters that we'll want to take into account when we try to piece it all together. What I'll do in the talk, as I do in the book, I'll go back about 500 years, but I'll only spend about a minute or two on those 500 years. I'll concentrate on the last 50 years, and in particular on the last decade or so, where things have really been changing rapidly, bringing us to where we are today. But the book that I wrote and the topic we're confronting does start with a recognition that since the mid-1500s, since the Portuguese found the sea route to Asia around the Cape of Good Hope, no state or empire has held the top position in world politics as being the dominant power of world politics without simultaneously fielding the world's most powerful navy. Okay? It's an irony of history that when the Portuguese arrived in Asia in the mid-1500s, about 20 years earlier, the Chinese had decided to pull back from the seas. If you go back to the 1500s, by far and away, the most sophisticated fleet in the world was Chinese. A vast fleet that they would sail around the Indian Ocean. Benjamin Franklin, later on, when he was Postmaster General in London and did some of the very first work to understand the ocean currents and to chart the kind of the way the oceans work, wrote about ship design. And he wrote about the Chinese fleet, about how sophisticated the hull design of those ships were. The largest ship in the Chinese fleet was 7 times larger than the largest ship in Europe at the time. This is at the height of the kind of European empires. An extraordinarily sophisticated fleet. But for a range of historical reasons we won't go into, China pulled back from the seas. It decided to kind of scudder the fleet and pull back from sea power altogether in the early 1500s. And so by accident of history, when Europe arrived in Asia, instead of confronting this powerful Chinese fleet, they found nothing. They found no sea power in Asia. And the Portuguese were able to dominate the high seas, not nothing, but no naval power in Asia. And the Portuguese were able to dominate the high seas in Asia in the absence of any rival power. They were followed by the Dutch, the French, the Spanish briefly, but then by far and away most consequentially the British, who for 300 years ruled the waves. That's where I took the title of the book, the old Gilbert and Sullivan song, to rule the waves. Rule Britannia, Britannia rule the waves. It was the Royal Navy that allowed Britain to be the dominant imperial power for almost 300 years, and used that naval power to push its way into India, and then later into China. And the move of Britain into China, it's first actually the English East India Company, but then quickly backed up by the Royal Navy in what are called the Opium Wars in the 1850s, to my mind really begins the era that we're in. It sets the terms of modern trade. If you read the documents of the WTO, which I do not recommend you do because they're very boring, but I have done, a lot of the language of the WTO documents can be found in the treaties that the British forced the Chinese to sign at the end of the Opium Wars in the 1850s, the Treaty of Nanking and the Treaty of the Bogue. Okay? And it's the Chinese economy essentially collapses in on itself. In the early 1800s, the estimates of the percentage of world GDP owned by the Indians and the Chinese were roughly a third each. That collapses to about 3% each. Right? And for the next 100 years, Europe is the dominant force until the United States comes up behind it. We will not spend a lot of time on the First and the Second World War, but naval power matters a great deal to those dynamics. Germany's reach for naval power is what causes Britain to rearm itself at the start of the Second World War, a critical driver of the start of the Second World War. The First World War. Second World War, obviously naval dynamics matter quite a lot to bringing us into the war through Pearl Harbor. We end up at the end of World War II as the dominant naval power in the world. And the fact of the U.S. Navy, our capacity to deploy the U.S. Navy literally anywhere in the world, is a crucial feature of American power in the period of the Cold War and beyond. But I will say that sort of during the Cold War, after the first phase of it, naval issues sort of receded somewhat, right? We had become a land power in Europe. We had large numbers of troops physically stationed in Europe. which is unusual historically, but we did. And with the advent of the nuclear arms race, our primary preoccupation was nuclear weapons, and then later in that, this space-based defense against nuclear weapons. So nuclear weapons, I mean, it still mattered, the fleet. We had nuclear weapons on submarines, was an important part of our nuclear triad. But naval issues weren't front and center in our minds, and they certainly weren't in the post-Cold War period. But in that exact period, when we were concentrating in the military sphere, in the kind of strategic sphere, when we were concentrating on nuclear weapons and land forces in Europe and the Russian forces, the oceans were about to become extremely important in another domain, which is trade. By the way, I'm a big believer in the old adage that power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. But every now and again, it's useful to have some maps. So I have some maps for this presentation. Thinking about this talk, I was just doing a little homework, and I found this map. This is a CIA map from the 1950s, which shows the patterns of world trade. And basically what you're looking at is fruit, vegetables, and natural resources being imported from South America into the United States and from Africa into Europe. Okay? Trade in the 1950s is basically a flow of natural resources from the quote-unquote South up into the two industrial centers of the world, which are the United States and Europe. All right? That's the world of the 1950s. And it starts to change, and it changes dramatically, but slowly. And it changes in part because of an American entrepreneur by the name of McLean, who was a trucking entrepreneur, and got thoroughly sick and tired of delays in getting stuff off his trucks and onto ships in the port of Newark. Okay? And he would describe, he'd got all this, he was a trucking guy, he had all this stuff in his truck, he was selling it to someplace, and he'd pull up at a port, and it would take days and days to offload stuff from the trucks, and it would sit in the wharf for days and days. It'd load it onto a ship, go up to another port, offload it, spend days and days on a wharf, and then it would load it up to his trucks. And he said to himself, well, what if I just drove the truck onto the ship? And he did. And he sort of retrofitted a ship, and he was able to drive 3 of his trucks onto the ship. Then he realized, okay, but now I can't use the trucks while we're on the ship, so that doesn't work. So he sort of retrofitted the trucks, and he created this thing where you could take the the kind of big container at the back of the truck. You'd actually take it off the truck and just put it on the ship. And that sounds like a tiny thing. It revolutionized global trade. Okay, completely revolutionized global trade. Because what it did is it made it hugely more efficient to move goods from rail to truck to sea. When he started this, he sailed a boat called the Ideal Axe out of the port of Newark in 1956, and it had 56 of those containers on it. That was a big deal at the time. Okay, and for a while, container shipping was basically going up and down the east coast of the United States. And he created a company called Sealand, from sea to land. And he thought, well, I bet I could do this to Europe too. And he started sending stuff to Europe. And instead of just these lines up and down the two industrial centers, we started seeing trade across the Atlantic Ocean. This is also as Europe is beginning to recover from the Second World War. And in that period, the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, there was a direct one-to-one line between the scale of shipping and the scale of trade and the scale of the global economy. A direct one-to-one line. Okay? He starts off with 56 boxes, then he has a ship that has around 100, then he has around 200, then he has 400 on a ship. There's an economist called Mark Levinson wrote a book about all this in the late 80s, early 90s, I guess. He did a second edition. And by the time Mark was writing about this, his mind was completely blown by the fact that they had gotten up to 4,000 containers on a ship. Okay? Almost all of it between the United States and Europe. But then 2 things happened. The Korean War and the Vietnamese War. And guess what happens when you deploy large amounts of American power in Asia? You got to get a lot of stuff there. And so what does the Army do? They figure out, oh, well, we should use these boxes too. And they start shipping large volumes of stuff in these containers, and you have to build ports that can receive the containers. And so they build a port in Busan in Korea, and there's a port in Philippines. And lo and behold, the Asian economies enter globalization. The Koreans, the Japanese, the Singaporeans, and, by the way, Hong Kong. Hong Kong, you'll remember at the time, was British and becomes a very major port. It's the kind of Western hub for globalization in Asia and rapidly rises up the ranks of the largest ports in the world. Okay? This is trade in the 1950s. If we go to the next slide, this is trade today. Okay? Every sea route in the world, connecting every economy in the world, bulk shipping, commodities, consumer goods, oil, gas, cars, everything that we consume in American society, everything that Europe consumes, everything that Japan consumes, everything that China produces is moved by sea along these sea routes. Now that looks like it's truly global, but if we go to the next slide, you can see in the intensity, that's by volume, it's essentially two lines. It's between the east coast of the United States and Europe and the east coast of China and the rest of the world, okay? And one of the ways I tell the story of this is in the book is I go to a bunch of ports. I went to the port of New York and went into the place where they examine all the stuff that come into our economy, and it's just astonishing to see these kind of huge container warehouses full of literally everything that we consume, whether it's paper products or photocopiers or oranges or rice or paper towels or cars or motorcycles. Everything that we consume is coming in on these ports. We are all following the story of the container ships that are backed up out of the Los Angeles Long Beach, right? Huge supply chain delays causing inflation in this country. I took the world's largest container ship. I sailed from Singapore up to Shanghai. Remember I told you Mark Levinson was astonished to see that these container ships had grown to 4,000 containers. The ship I was on had 20,526 containers. Okay, if you clip forward, we can see, this is all the ships in the world yesterday. If we go a little bit forward, that's me on the Madrid Maersk. And if we zoom out a little bit, you can get a little bit of a sense of how big that ship is. And one more, you get a sense of the size of it. In shipping, we're used to thinking of aircraft carriers as giant ships. If you take the USS Nimitz, which is the largest aircraft carrier in the world, you can put two of it in that thing and still have room left over for the Empire State Building. Okay, if you clip one more, you can see a little graphic of that. All right. Totally transformed global trade. You hear the word globalization, what do you think of? You think of high technology, you think of airplane travel, you think of these kinds of things. 85% of global trade moves by sea. 85% in this kind of ship, okay? And bulk carriers. And it's not just consumer goods. One of the other things that's happened over the last 20 years is a huge change in energy production and distribution. I know there are a number of you in the room who have worked on energy issues. This is a revolution that started in the United States, as did the shipping revolution. It's a revolution that starts in offshore drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. What starts in Mexico, Gulf of Mexico, didn't stay in the Gulf of Mexico. We are now seeing offshore drilling all over the world. And, obviously we've long imported and exported oil by tanker, but the volumes of those have increased. And by my calculations at this point, 80% of the world's supply of oil and about 60% of the world's supply of gas is either found by sea or moves by sea to its final market. So the story of energy, just like the story of trade, has become a story of the seas. Okay? And we can spend more time on that and questions if we're interested. What on earth does any of this have to do with Xi Jinping and Joe Biden? The answer is that vast quantities of this stuff move in and out of Chinese ports. Right? I told you that I sailed from Singapore to Shanghai. And what I mean by Shanghai, not literally Shanghai, it's the container terminal at Shanghai, okay, which is on Yangchang Port's man-made, or the tiny little island that they reclaimed into the port. The container port in Shanghai is 6 times larger than Los Angeles Long Beach, okay? Go back to the 1980s and look at the top 10 ports in the world, 5 of them American, 5 of them European. Go to the 1990s, and there's Japan in there as well. Go to the 2000s, and adding Hong Kong and Singapore. Then a really important thing happens. Several important things. Cold War ends. China joins the WTO. And Hong Kong goes back to China. And one of the world's largest ports and one of the world's most sophisticated trading ports, with all of the trade infrastructure and legal infrastructure and financial infrastructure that goes along with it, goes from the West into China in the form of Hong Kong. Richard, who's here in the audience, was deeply involved in that. We may have some more conversation about that. This is at a time, if you think back to a few years ago, we were all talking about the emerging powers, right? China, Brazil, India, others, kind of countries that had stayed out of the West and stayed out of the Soviet space during the Cold War, but we're entering globalization, we're growing rapidly. And they all entered globalization more or less at the same time. But I liken it to saying, let's say that there were 3 siblings, and they all decided to start their own businesses at the same time. But then a few months after they started their businesses, one of them inherited the world's largest merchant bank. Well, guess which one was going to grow fast, right? And acquiring Hong Kong and that huge port of trade at the beginning of the sort of takeoff, the entry of China into globalization. It's a huge boon to China. If you forward fast to the 2000s and you look at the top 10 ports in the world, Shanghai's in there, and there are a couple other Chinese ports in there. Fast forward to the present day, Shanghai, 6 times larger than Los Angeles, Long Beach, which is the largest port in the West. The next 5 largest ports in the world are all in China. There are no Western ports in the top 10. All right, it's just this massive shift of trade to China. All right. Now, think about it from Beijing's perspective. All right, your economy is growing massively. You've become the 2nd largest economy in the world. You're vastly dependent on the flow of goods in and out of your ports all along your eastern seaboard. Okay? Who secures that trade? We do. It's the U.S. Navy. All right? Since the end of the Second World War, a central purpose, a central sort of doctrine of the U.S. Navy has been to secure the freedom of the seas, freedom of navigation, freedom of commerce on the high seas. We patrol the waterways along China's eastern seaboard and the wider Pacific and Indian Ocean on which all that trade sails, which from one vantage point is extremely convenient, right? They get to trade vastly and grow, etc., and we do the expensive work of maintaining a global navy that secures that from piracy and from other threats. On the other hand, if you're China and you're rising rapidly and you're becoming a major power, are you really comfortable with the notion that your own economy, this vital lifeblood of trade and energy into your ports, is secured by the U.S. Navy? Maybe not. And what we start to see in the 1990s is a deep change in Chinese strategic thinking. Let's go to the next slide if we could, if I think we're in the right place. Yeah, I'll come back to this. We're going to be, you can stay there for now, but we're going to come back to the maps. If you think about the history of China, right? Revolution, Civil War in the 1930s, communist takeover in the 1940s under Mao, a very poor country, had been for the previous 100 years occupied in some fashion, at least parts of the country, by various imperial powers, including us, by the way. You know, there's all this talk these days about sort of the longest running American war, and, you know, is it Afghanistan or is it our presence in Korea? No, the longest running ever U.S. military deployment is on the Yangtze River in Shanghai, where we were for almost 100 years. We had American forces inside China patrolling the Yangtze River for almost 100 years. Okay, we put down, together with the British, the Russians, and the Japanese, the Boxer Rebellion in the 1890s. We have long been present inside China and in the waters surrounding China. That's just a little historical tidbit. China starts to look at this. All right, so they came out of the Communist Revolution with a doctrine called deep inland defense. What did it mean? It meant that if one of the more powerful countries in the world tried to attack China, what they would do is retreat inland, as Mao had done, and simply bleed the external invaders, right? And they could survive through the long march and these kinds. So deep inland defense was their notion of their own defense. And that lasted for a couple of decades after the communist takeover. And then as they begin to get a little bigger and a little more consolidated, they thought, well, maybe we can actually defend ourselves at the coastline. Maybe we could actually stop invaders from, coming on shore. And they begin to have a notion of coastal defense, all right? But then all this stuff that I just described happens around trade. And they begin to understand that their entire economy is dependent on the flow of goods in and out of these waters. And they begin to think, well, maybe we need to have a defense in those seas themselves. And they adopt a concept of what they call the near seas defense. So let's just pause for a minute and take a couple of moments on the map. So this is the Pacific Ocean, okay? West coast of the United States, Hawaii right in the middle, and then over here, East Asia, Japan, China, etc. Let's zoom in one. The Western Pacific, sort of everything west of Hawaii, and let's zoom in one farther. China basically has 3 major economic zones, okay? There's a big zone around Beijing, there's a big zone around Shanghai, and there's a big zone around Hong Kong, Guangzhou. Now, you're getting stuff into your economy and you want to sell stuff out of your economy, you got to get it there, and it's going to go by ship, and it's got to go on one of a few routes. So you could sail out of ports near Beijing, and you could sail out this way. Well, that's not very comfortable because there's a U.S. allied and major U.S. bases there, and U.S. allied major bases here. So that's not so comfortable. You can't go out here because this is all Japanese islands. There's Japanese islands that go all the way down to Taiwan. We're going to come back to Taiwan. Taiwan isn't a U.S. ally, but we have a pretty substantial defense partnership with Taiwan, so that's not so comfortable. So now you're down through the Taiwan Strait. This is called the Luzon Strait, and I'm going to come back to that, but now you're down into Philippine waters. Philippines an ally, complicated ally, but it's an ally, and U.S. defense assets and bases and ships there. So now you got to come all the way down here. You can't go through here. There's no sea channel there. You got to come down to here. That's Singapore. Not an ally, but we have a base there. With it, we keep a lot of ships there. And even once you get there, you have to go out through the Malacca Strait and you hit India. Had 3 wars with India. Or you can come down here and you hit Australia. In other words, no matter where you look, you're surrounded by U.S. allies. You're completely encircled by U.S. allies. All right? And China starts to develop a nervousness about the capacity of the United States to choke off these waters. Not really helped much by the fact that at that time, the Department of Defense and the Navy start publishing a whole series of scenarios about how we would cut off those waters in a range of circumstances. I mean, look, we also have scenarios for invading Canada, right? We're not planning to do it, but we publish these things. It's an odd thing we do in this country. Chinese naval planners read our naval planning, and they say, oh, look, the U.S. Navy has plans to choke off these seas. That would be awkward for us. So in addition to building up our naval forces in these seas, this is the Yellow Sea, the East China Sea, the Taiwan Strait, and the South China Sea, we're going to worry about our capacity to protect our force inside these waters. By the way, at the same time, China made vast claims, sovereign claims to these waters in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, what's called the 9-line, which is shown here. Huge claims where there's a ton of energy, huge reserves of oil and gas, and by the way, a ton of fish, which matters when you're trying to feed 500 million growing middle class who live on that coast. So they're making vast claims to these waters. They're building up their naval fleet in these waters. But now they're worried about how they protect their naval fleet in these waters. All right? And so they start developing a concept called counterinsurgency defense. What does that mean? It means, they've got quite a lot of naval capacity in here now. All right? If there's a crisis, we're going to come to our Navy here, our Navy here, our partners here, our naval here, our partners here, and we're going to got assets out in Guam and the Marianas and Hawaii, and we're going to surge them all in through the Luzon Strait. Okay? So China starts thinking, well, it's not enough to be able to defend ourselves in the near seas. We've got to stop the United States from reinforcing itself through the Luzon Strait, and they develop what they call a counterinsurgency doctrine. And what that essentially means is really sophisticated missiles that can knock out our aircraft carriers and knock out our defenses out here. And they start to build up man-made islands in the South China Sea. During the Obama era, Obama extracts a promise from them that they will never militarize those islands. Right? That lasts for a couple years. And they end up putting missile systems on Woody Island, which is just about here. And then Fiery Reef, which is a great name, and Mischief Reef, I thought another great name for what they're up to. They end up militarizing the South China Sea because it extends the range of their missiles. Okay, and we're saying Chinese anti-ship missiles are perhaps the most sophisticated missile system in the world right now. We have the more powerful army. We can talk about that, but we cannot match the sophistication of Chinese anti-ship missiles. All right. So for all of the power of our Navy, we're in this very delicate situation right now where the bulk of our naval power is out here. In a crisis scenario, we need to get it into here. They've got missiles that can hit us out here. All right. So we start developing new concepts ourselves. And the core, I won't bore you with the kind of military jargon and the acronyms, etc., but the core of our concept is to use a new combination of air power, sea power, and long-range missile strike to take out Chinese defenses, right, if we needed to in a crisis moment. But I want to thereby start conveying a flavor of what has been happening over the last This is about a decade that we've been developing these naval concepts, and they've been developing these naval concepts. If you just click over one. I spent some time on this ship called the USS John Paul Jones. It's the most sophisticated ballistic missile destroyer in the U.S. fleet. Okay, so it has on deck, on ship, about 90 missiles that can do several things. It has tomahawk missiles that can hit land. It has antiship missiles. But the most important thing it has is anti-ballistic missiles. Okay, so China shoots a missile. This ship can shoot up a missile that'll intercept that missile and knock it out of the skies. Okay, so that's our answer to the missile, to China's missile fleet. The problem with that is you have to sail this thing about 6,000 miles away from San Diego, and it has 90 missiles on it. China, operating from its own mainland, can toss hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of missiles at this thing and exhaust our defenses. Okay. What's our answer? Submarines. The reason the Australia, UK, US submarine deal was such a big deal is because submarines are our ultimate answer to the Chinese missile system. The Chinese cannot find our submarines. They cannot detect our submarines. Our submarines are equipped with the same kind of missiles as well as nuclear missiles. So if you go back one slide, Deb, thank you. If we're trying to stop the Chinese, they've got a lot of power in here now. We've got a lot of power out here. In a crisis, we need to surge our forces in. They're going to try to stop us with their missiles. What we're going to have to do is put a bunch of submarines in here, use those submarines to take out the first wave of their defenses. That means we can move our aircraft carriers in, and we can launch airstrikes to where their missiles are, about 1,000 miles inland. They have some responses too. They know we'll do that. So out here, they've got what are called nuclear barrage mechanisms, right? So they can explode nuclear devices underwater. Nuclear anti-submarine warfare, how we're going to defeat the Soviets. If the Soviets were going to send their submarine fleet out with their nuclear missiles, we were going to explode a bunch of nuclear bombs at sea, which would disorient their subs. Chinese have that capacity here. What I'm trying to depict is this is not some minor question of, an American frigate someplace clashing with a Chinese frigate someplace. This is large-scale, highly sophisticated, highly technologized missile warfare, which involves us striking deep inland Chinese territory. Okay. Now, I want to step back for a minute from the military mechanics. I can understand this. If we think about what I was saying before about sort of China's motivations, China has several motivations, but certainly in the era of Hu Jintao, it seems to me, I've gone back through a lot of this documentation, it seems to me the primary motivation they have is to reduce their vulnerability here, okay? They're worried about our ability to choke off these seas. They want to stop us from having that capacity. We could even more damage than we could choke off their energy flows. That's how we defeated Japan, Second World War, right? But if all they're trying to do is protect the flow of trade, why should we worry about that? We want that trade too. Our economy is dependent on, look what's happening in Long Beach, right? So if all they're doing is protecting the flow of trade, that should be all right. But there's a big change when Xi Jinping comes into power. And versus talking about near seas defense and protecting commerce and this sort of stuff, Xi Jinping starts talking about the far seas, the Arctic, the Indian Ocean, the Atlantic, the Southern Ocean. Okay, they start building aircraft carriers. They start extending the range of their missiles. They start acquiring ports in Africa, in the Indian Ocean, in the Mediterranean. They start cooperating with the Russian Navy. And if you're an American naval planner or a strategic planner, you have to start asking yourselves, is it really just about the defense of trade? Is that really all that's going on in Chinese strategy? And I think it becomes clear in a lot of people's mind that it's not all that's going on in Chinese strategy, that China is, in fact, trying to develop a blue water naval capacity to push back on our hegemony and our dominance. Plus, there's a huge thorn in this story, which is Taiwan. For two reasons. If you don't want to feel constrained inside this, the Chinese call it the first island chain. Okay? If you don't want to feel constrained inside that territory. What you really want is a base out here. Right? If you have bases in Taiwan, in the eastern coast of Taiwan, you can sail direct to Hawaii without encountering another U.S. ally. Okay? And what we know from pretty good intelligence and a lot of other sources is that in Xi Jinping's mind, not only is that strategically important, it's also hugely important to him politically to secure the, quote, reunification with Taiwan. That it is his sense that his legacy as the, quote, third great leader of China depends on him ultimately acquiring that little piece of territory, okay, and the 30 million people that live there. And you can't really separate China's military development and its defensive purposes from the naval capacity they'll need to take Taiwan. And so both for strategic purposes and for the question of preventing the reunification of Taiwan, we have gotten to the point where we are deeply, our military, our defense establishment, deeply worried about the scale and intensity of Chinese naval buildup in those waters. That's the genesis to the nuclear deal. It's why we do as much ballistic missile testing as we do. It's why they have now tested a hypersonic missile that can avoid our ballistic missile defenses. All right, that's, I think, the backdrop to what we were seeing over the last several months. So I said, slowly, and suddenly. Slowly, in the 1990s, this decision to go back to the seas for the first time in 500 years. Slowly building up the capacity to defend themselves in the near seas. Slowly developing a capacity to go to the far seas and to stop us from coming in. And suddenly, we are in a very tense arms race in those waters. My last point before I shut up and we can open up to things is, as I said at the beginning, we're not the only folks there. The Russians have reactivated large parts of their navy. It's not nearly as big as it was during the Cold War, but it's pretty sophisticated, including their submarine fleet. The Japanese have reactivated, in a sense, the second largest submarine fleet in the world. They've changed their interpretation of their own laws such that they can come to the defense of a U.S. or a Japanese or Australian or other allied ship if attacked by Chinese missiles. And they recently clarified that they would also come to the defense of Taiwan in the case of a Chinese attack. Okay. The Indians. If you're China and you want to escape all this stuff, you want to come out through here, or you build a land bridge over Burma and you come out into the Indian Ocean. But then there's India. There's a 1,000-foot dagger in the heart of Chinese ambitions in the Indian Ocean. All right. India doesn't have much of a navy, but it's building it real fast. Britain was just, having been the dominant naval power, really sort of wasn't for the last 50 years, has just successfully commissioned and started to sail 2 aircraft carriers, and guess where they went? The maiden voyage of the HMS Queen Elizabeth sailed through that strait, the Luzon Strait. Okay, the French, who you probably saw, were a little bit annoyed by the Australia-UK deal, have substantial possessions in these waters, which are pretty important for us for basing rights, actually. So my argument is that this little stretch of water here, the Luzon Strait, is now the most critically dangerous territory in the world. It is, to the new arms race, what East Germany was to the Cold War. It's where, ultimately, if things go really south, that is where actual militarized conflict between ourselves and the Chinese will start. And that is the most critical and tense piece of geography in the world. And when they decided to have the summit, it was in part because in the preceding months, we, the British, the Australians, a whole bunch of navies had been sailing aircraft carriers and ships up and down these waters, demonstrating our continued right to sail in these waters as we see it. China sent 150 air sorties through Taiwanese airspace in response, and the test of the hypersonic glide missile, which is a missile that can evade our defenses. We're seeing this kind of tit-for-tat escalation in the arms race with that geography. Tensions with China, these broader issues, they go well beyond these waters, but to my estimation, this is where the rubber hits the road in terms of the critical issues that are in front of us and were a huge part of the agenda when President Biden and Xi Jinping were talking privately the other day, thanks to Joe Shaw for the timing. So why don't I stop there, and we can open it up to any of a number of topics that I've touched on, and we'll simply be led by all of you.
I never understood. Oh, that's a statement.
Why did I never understand?
Why were those atolls allowed in the South China Sea allowed?
Yeah. So it's really interesting. I have to be a little careful here because some of what I do in work which is off the record, and I shouldn't reveal some things, but I will say that in the period of 2015-2016, when they were starting to militarize those atolls, starting to build them up, started to militarize them, there was some pretty advanced planning on how to respond by members of one party and by the foreign policy establishment of another party. Neither of those group of people ended up in the White House. And there was a period of real focus on that question in 2015-2016. It was not the focus that President Trump brought to bear. President Trump shifted the question to the economic dimension, right? And so we had the trade war and we had all that kind of stuff. That stuff continued apace. Now, that being said, when I talk about detailed planning for what to do about it, one of the detailed plans that was being discussed, I'll just say by people who are currently in power, was to take them out militarily. Okay, that would have been easier then than now. But what I try to convey, and I do more of this in the book, is to explain that it's not as if we could just sail one ship in there, launch a few missiles, knock them out, right? It would have triggered large-scale naval, air, missile warfare between ourselves and the People's Republic of China, right? This is not a scenario where we could take some surgical action to take them out. That would have triggered war. There are some who think we should have done that, even if it did trigger a war, because better to fight that war 5 years ago than now than 5 years from now. I was a little conflicted on that point of view myself, to be perfectly honest. By now, we can't do it. We don't have the capacity to get in there without already, we have to fight our way in, and would have to fight our way in at very substantial cost. So that opportunity is lost. They now have dominance in those waters, short of us launching full-scale effort to retake them, as I said, including large-scale strikes on mainland China. So it's not a trivial decision to take.
Dr. Jones, and I'll do this quick so Deb doesn't kick me. When you look at a president like Xi, who's there for life, what do you see as his drivers, things that are driving him? Trade, obviously, outside is important, but they can't feed their own population. They don't have enough energy supply. So yep. You could argue a lot of their port development around the world is to deal with the problems that they have back at home. And ultimately, won't that help bring the Chinese to the table to work out solutions rather than dealing with military problems?
So I was more optimistic on that front a few years ago than I am now. Okay, I sort of passed over this lightly. I spent a lot of time on it in the book, the period, but three different elements of that. Okay, one that you touched on is energy flows. For all of their effort to build pipelines out to Russia and to Kazakhstan, for all of the flows that they now get from the Barents Sea, the Yamal Peninsula, etc., it's still the case that 50% of their energy imports, oil and fuel, come through the Singapore Strait. Okay, so we can still choke off those flows should we choose to. So they still feel an acute vulnerability on the energy front. 500 million people who live on the eastern seaboard within 100 miles of that coastline, who have gone from poverty to middle class or at least lower middle income status. That means they consume a lot more protein, right? We've seen the huge pork production, pork acquisitions here, but the main source of that protein is fish. One of the things I didn't talk about today is climate change. The South China Sea is very shallow, and when a shallow sea gets warm, its fish stocks die off. So you've got the world's hungriest, the most rapidly growing appetite in terms of sort of net consumption of protein in that part of the world, trying to fish out of a sea whose fishing stock is reducing. Meanwhile, out of Alaska, the waters are getting colder because of climate change, ironically. Sea ice melts, makes the water colder. It's a huge boom for fishing. So we're having this huge boom in fishing stocks. Same thing in parts of the Atlantic. So their fishing fleet are way out, 3,000 or 4,000 miles out beyond their shores, trying to capture some of that fish. Very insecure about that. First time there was an actual clash between a Chinese naval ship and another ship in these waters was a Filipino fishing fleet, Filipino fishing vessel. All right. And when you look at the ports around the world, I spent a lot of time on this. They're commercial ports, but they're commercial ports that can be rapidly reinforced by Chinese Marines. And in one case, which is Djibouti, they've now built an actual naval base right beside it. Okay. I started with history. In the book, I spent a little time on a place called Param Island. Param Island is 2 miles long and 3 miles deep and barren, and has in its history been owned by the Ottomans, the Portuguese, the British, the French, and the Soviets. Why? Because it's at the entrance between the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean and the Suez Canal above it. It's a critical choke point. Guess where China built its first naval base? 18 miles off the coast of Param Island. All right. So what I write about in the book, it's a kind of a sense of tragedy. They have this need to be out there, engage in trade, engage in the acquisition of resources, flowing it all back home. We could have been in a world where we saw both of us want that globalization to work, and we'll do that. And in fact, I spent a chapter on this in the book. We did it for about 7 or 8 years on piracy. We started to see this huge spike in piracy in the Indian Ocean. It was the Europeans and us under NATO and the EU that started doing the patrolling to defend against the piracy. And who came along? The Chinese, the Russians, the Indians, because we all have this huge stake in trade. But it began to break down, and it began to break down in that geography, right, and it breaks down in the change between Hu Jintao and Xi Jinping, where a more commercially oriented, globalization-oriented, cooperation-oriented posture begins to shift to something which is much more, I don't want to use the word aggressive per se, but well, certainly in that tone of voice, right, is a much more ambitious, that's the word I'm looking for, posture. And then at the same time, of course, I'm talking about these sets of issues. There are lots of other things happening. Crackdown on the Uyghurs is starting to happen in a big way. They're kind of laying the foundations of a crackdown on Hong Kong, pressures on Taiwan, manipulations in other countries, a very deep change in the tenor of Chinese diplomacy. But the driver, at least in our attitudes, was worrying about this question, their buildup of the naval fleet and what they intended to do with it. And I write about in the book a moment in the turn of the century, in the early 1900s. The early 1900s, when Britain has the largest navy in the world and the largest trade flows in the world. But Germany is the number 2 trader in the world, and it says out loud it wants to build up its trading capacity and wants to build up its trading fleet, and therefore it also wants to build up its naval fleet to protect that. Okay, and there's a British diplomat called Sir Admiral Crow, or Sir something Crow, anyway, Sir Crow, who's in the Foreign Office, and he writes a memo which has become known as the Crow Memorandum. And he says, the Germans are a commercial power. They're growing. There's a logic for why they should want to build up their naval fleet. It may be that they have purely commercial and defensive purposes, but we can't take that risk. What if we're wrong? What if they change their mind? And as I was working on this, I was watching these debates inside the U.S. Navy. Is this commercial only? Are the global ports for commercial, or are they laying the foundation for something else? And I could see this memo being rewritten in real time. Maybe this is only commercial, but can we take the risk? Do we trust Xi Jinping to have only commercial ambitions for this? And so you see this very classic, sort of tragic interplay between two powers staking their claims to the capacity to dominate the blue waters of the world's oceans. Classic dilemma we've seen through history, and we're now back into in the case of the Chinese.
Considering how the takeover of Hong Kong has happened, do you see any way that they're not going to end up taking Taiwan?
Look, so this is, I think, the kind of $60,000 question, right? I spent a lot of time on this in Washington with people who know China better than I do. I spent a lot of time on it with people in the intelligence community. I think everybody I talk to has the same essential conclusion and the same essential knowledge gap. The conclusion is that there is no question that Xi has absolute intent to reunify their term, right? Reunify Taiwan. Absolute intent. Prefers to do it politically, right? For an important reason. Let's say that he launched a military effort to retake Taiwan or to take Taiwan, and we went in to try to stop him. Let's say we lost, which we might. That would be a substantial blow to American power, to American prestige, to American order, etc. But it would not collapse the American political regime. What if he loses? What if he launches that bid and he loses? That could collapse his regime. All right. So I think it's a very high stakes thing for him to do. He's got to have a great deal of confidence that he's going to be able to win. That depends on a whole lot of variables that are not in his control. So my assessment and many others is that he prefers to do it politically. That was a whole lot easier before Hong Kong, right? Hong Kong has basically killed the political option for Taiwan, at least in the short to medium term, which leaves the military option. So then the big unknowable is when. Won't be before the Olympics. Will it be a year from now, 6 years from now, 10 years from now? I would sincerely doubt he does it before he's reappointed for his third 5-year term. But he could do it. I confess the thing that keeps me up at night most, we haven't talked about a very different part of the world, which is Ukraine and Eastern Europe. And the thing that keeps me up at night is whether we come to a point where the Russians and the Chinese see enough distraction and weakness and they decide to do a two-prong move. The Russians move into Ukraine and the Chinese move into Taiwan. And in my estimation, it's not that we couldn't handle that militarily, but we would be so confused and so distracted and so disoriented, I'd be surprised if we could handle it politically. So that keeps me up at night.
Yeah, I'm just curious, if you were the leading kind of guide for Biden, what would you tell him to do in this situation? How would you advise him over the next couple of years?
Yes, I will say, there are things that I should be clear. Most of the people who work on China for Biden used to work for me at Brookings, so I'm a little biased. All right. So you won't be surprised I'm relatively sympathetic to their approach. But let me just clarify what I think the approach is. Okay. I mean, you see that Chinese naval buildup, and it seems to me there are 3 basic responses you can have. One is to say, we're out. Okay. Leave Asia to the Asians. And there are people who are arguing that. That would make sense if you thought that terrain would be stable. If you thought that the Japanese, the Koreans, the North Koreans, and the Chinese would all engage in a series of stable, sensible, logical decisions about their situation. I don't know any read of history that tells you that would happen, right? I don't know any reason to think that that's what it would be. What we would watch is an intense militarization, an incredibly intense buildup of the arms race, and extreme tensions which could easily spill out into conflict in waters that constitute 50% of the world's economy, right? And absolutely vital for our economy. Everything that we consume and produce flows through those waters one way or another. So the whole sort of let's just leave and hope they sort it out seems like it's not really a great plan. Second thing you do is you go mano a mano with the Chinese. The Chinese are building up to about a 350 ship fleet. We could say, well, we've got 200 ships, we need 200 more. Let's just start building, right? And we could do that. I mean, you would like to think we could do that. We have been able in past times to do such things as a country. We don't really seem able to do much as a country these days, but theoretically, at least, we could do that. But you have to bear in mind that although we still have the more sophisticated Navy, we're still the larger economy, we're still the more powerful military, etc., they fight that fight 80 miles off their coast. We fight it 7,000 miles from San Diego. That is just a giant advantage. So we don't have to have a 400 naval strong fleet to deal with. Therefore, we have to have an 800 strong, right? We have to it's an extremely expensive thing to do. So path number 3, build up your alliance structure. deepen the cooperation with the Australians, deepen the cooperation with the Japanese, deepen the cooperation with the Singaporeans, deepen the cooperation with the Europeans, which is what they're doing. And if you add the Australian fleet and the Japanese fleet and the Taiwanese fleet and the Korean fleet and the French fleet and the British fleet, well, now we're back up to a 500-ship fleet, right? And in particular, when you look at submarines, we have a substantial advantage over the Chinese in submarines, as do the Japanese, as do the British, and soon the Australians will too. So we could sort of go into more detail about tactics and stuff like that, but strategically, it strikes me that that is the obvious play is to build up that alliance structure in the Western Pacific and not to be there mano a mano, but to be there with allies. I could be critical of this or that tactic and this or that decision, but at core, it seems to me it's the obvious and the logical play.
Well, enjoyed your presentation. There's more questions than I had time to ask. But for 40 years, the United States and the West, that being Europe, the United States, and the Eastern West, Japan, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, that had done a Marshall Plan on China.
Yeah.
We did. The Republicans wanted, not the Republicans, sorry, the politicians wanted China to be another Japan, for us to be able to convert them to a democracy. And maybe they were going on for it until the late 1990s. The business people said, wow, 1.2 billion people.
Yeah.
So I think your analogy, I think we are extremely weak as far as an ocean. We have 1/4 of the population, 1/3 or 3.5% of the population of China. What they have done in 40 years is excessive, and we're doing the white man's approach. Let's attack them. They got evil intent. But my reaction after living for 79 years is it's the United States that usually starts that discussion. My question to you is, what does it matter if the United States gets inland into China? There's not much inland into China. And how important is Russia? Russians admit, if you look at their GDP and their population, it is nothing. So my question is, why can't we approach China? Because what I think they're going to is it's a dominant power replacing the United States in the world. They have so many resources. They're looking at space, they're looking at nuclear energy, they're looking at everything. Sorry to be so long.
Well, a couple of things. First, as I said in the outset, actually I should have said this right up front because I set this up in part of this question sort of, are we in a new Cold War? And one of the reasons why I don't think that's a good way to think about the situation we're in is if you think about the Cold War, you think about us and the Soviet Union, right? We had the Western Alliance, they had the Warsaw Pact. Think about the gap between the top power in each of those blocks and the next one down, right? So you have Soviet Union, and probably the next country in that pact was, let's say, is Poland, right? It is a pretty modest power in sort of geopolitical terms. With us, you go from the U.S., and then the next power down was, let's say it was Britain. Yeah, maybe the French would complain about me, but let's say it was Britain, right? Which is about 1/10 of our size in every sense of that word. So you had two powers that were simply massively larger than the next layer of power down, and could really impose their will on their respective blocks. I do not think the world looks like that right now, right? We cannot impose our will on India in those terms. We cannot impose our will on the Europeans in those terms. Europe is a little bit smaller than us, but not that much smaller than us in economic terms. India is a pretty damn big country with quite a lot going for it. Japan is a serious country. We can impose our will on the Japanese to a certain degree because they feel so vulnerable, but they're a pretty substantial country. And when we say things like, oh, let's cut off trade with China, they say, yeah, thank you very much. We're going to go ahead and deepen trade with China. Thank you very much. So we're not in a situation where the two top powers can simply dictate the play, right? So one reason why I don't think plays out the way you said is that we could decide, screw it, they're in charge now, we're walking away. That is not how the Indians are going to react. That is not how the Japanese are going to react. That is not how, well, the Koreans might. The Koreans might say, all right, fine, we're flipping and we're going to go that route. But it's certainly not how the Japanese are going to react. It's not how the Indians are going to react. Look at the incredible turnaround in our relationship with the Vietnamese. Why? Because they do not want to live in that world. Right? They do not want to live in a world dominated by the Chinese. Neither do the Germans. So it may be where we end up. I hope it isn't. If you look at the net capacity, one of the reasons why I said I think the approach we're taking is the right one, lots of difficulties, lots of challenges ahead, but if you look at the United States, Japan, and Europe combined, if you look at the West, we're still larger than China in population, we're still larger than China in, not Europe, the United States, and Japan, we're around peer in population. Add India, we're substantially larger, right? So if you have the Quad, Australia, US, Japan, right? So if you take a lot of countries working together, it seems to me that then China is dealing with something rather more complex than just dealing mano a mano with the United States. I will say that it seems to me that despite Xi Jinping's own confidence, China still has a lot of internal challenges. They're at what, a third of our per capita GDP? They occupy per person GDP, right? Third to a half, depending on how you measure. That's still a very different position in global markets. They're very aware of that. There are these vulnerabilities. They don't have their own energy supply, et cetera. So I don't think we're going to, and I would personally not like us to simply cede to Chinese dominance of the international order. But even if we did, lots of other people would not come along. So for now, I think we're more likely to be in a system of substantial tension. Another reason I don't like the frame of the Cold War was one in which one of us was going to end up winning, right? We were going to end up destroying the Soviet regime, or they were going to end up destroying us, or they were going to end up collapsing. I think we have sailed back in, literally, to a world that looks a lot more like the 1800s and the 1900s, where there is a series of powers, ourselves, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Indians, the Russians, the various Europeans, who will be there, who will exert influence, who will be in tension with one another, who will compete, who will be in conflict at various times, and who will also cooperate on various things. And we may well be in that system for a very long time. And it may not be, them defeating us or us defeating them. It may not look anything remotely like that. I think that sort of much more 19th century world is a more likely one than the image that's conveyed by a Cold War. So.
Obviously, with the discussions between Xi and Biden this week, kind of the main area they looked to optimism and cooperation was climate change. I guess kind of my question has two parts. The first is, to what extent is China genuinely interested in addressing climate change? And then would that potential cooperation with the U.S. kind of work to open up more diplomatic opportunities?
This is the part of the topic where I kind of feel depressed about how cynical I've become as an old geezer. Let me say a few things. There are people in this administration, Kerry most importantly, trying to make the case that we should carve out climate as a zone of cooperation. Okay, good. Not really convinced that that's the way to do this. I'm much more focused on actually filling in the blanks of the UNFCCC regime, actually having verification and monitoring, actually being able to kind of put social and public pressure on countries, including ourselves. Remember that we are the country that has twice walked away from a global climate regime, right? Climate change is unbelievably complicated in terms of what has to happen to make this transition. So, we will go to Glasgow and we'll all say, by 2050 we'll have a net zero. What does that mean? It means we'll still do a lot of polluting, but somehow we'll pay somebody to grow trees or something, right? I mean, I'm being a little bit flip, but there's an awful lot of magical calculations that go into our net zero goals. By the way, if everybody was currently actually implementing their nationally determined contributions, we would be at about 2.8 degrees trajectory. Not a single country on this planet is actually implementing their nationally determined contributions, right? We're sort of on a 4 degrees track right now. Is China going to unplug itself from coal and gas and oil and essentially collapse its own? No, they're not. Guess what? Neither are we, right? We will use technologies to try to make some things cleaner or whatever. We're not unplugging from any of this stuff. So, I'm not super confident that that's going to be a big driver of cooperation. Second point I'll make is that although we always talk about, and people like Kerry talk about climate change as a kind of overall in it together, one of the things I did in the book is look at how climate is actually playing out. And I didn't spend a lot of time on this, but it turns out that the oceans matter to this story a great deal. Of the excess carbon that we've put into the atmosphere by the burning of fossil fuels over the last half century or so, 90% of the excess heat that's generated has been absorbed by the oceans. The reason we are not in a much worse situation than we are in terms of our weather is the oceans. But that's starting to run out because the chemistry of the oceans is changing. The more they absorb carbon, changes the calcium concentration in the ocean, changes what happens when fish poo, which is part of how climate works. Who knew? But it is. Fish, what they call marine snow is the more polite term. Is basically large-scale fish poop is part of what pulls carbon down into the bottom of the ocean and kind of the colder waters of the ocean. That chemical process is starting to break down. Oceans are warming. Oceans are rising. But it doesn't actually play out where we're all in this together for the next 30, 40, 50, 70, 80 years. It does out in the catastrophic scenarios, right? If we get to those catastrophic scenarios, then yeah, we're all sunk. But those are, worst case scenario, and they're 100, 150 years out. In all the scenarios before that, things get trickier. Sea levels rise, storms get worse, crazy weather in, Washington State and Vancouver this week and stuff and whatever. But it plays out completely differently on the world's oceans. If you live in the Bay of Bengal, sorry, I don't mean to use a technical term here, but you are screwed. But you're not if you live in Alaska, Huge boom for commerce, huge boom for fishing, for energy rights. It plays out very differently. And what I write about in the book is that what I think it's going to drive is a race towards marine engineering. And that marine engineering is going to be a huge new part, and it's got an adaptation around climate change. Guess who are the two major suppliers of capacity for marine engineering? Us and the Chinese. We're really good at it. Okay? It is a story of incredible entrepreneurship and innovation in the United States. We don't do nearly enough to talk about it or celebrate it. The other people who can do it at scale are the Chinese. We are not going to be sharing that capacity. We're going to be competing for those contracts. We're going to be competing for that capacity. You're going to be competing over fish. So I actually think in the kind of short to medium term, climate change is going to drive competition, not cooperation. I do want to have some optimism for you out of this. I do think that one of the important things that happened in the summit was they began to talk about something that that neither side has talked about yet, which is putting guardrails around all this. Okay, let me just give you an example of what I mean. Okay, I was sailing out. I showed you the picture of that ship, the ballistic missile destroyer, and I asked. I was out in Hawaii talking to the leadership of the Indo-Pacific Command, and I asked what contact they have with their Chinese counterparts. None. We have no mill-to-mill ties. Our military does not have a channel to their military. There is no red line. There is no defense-to-defense talks. There are no crisis management mechanisms. We don't have guardrails on this. If a Chinese nuclear submarine bumps into one of our nuclear submarines and a bunch of captains out in the Pacific start getting antsy, we have no capacity right now to handle that in our relationship. It's crazy. The most important thing, it seemed to me, that what happened in that summit was that they agreed that there needed to be a process among empowered officials to start building the guardrails against those kinds of crises. And that strikes me as a very important. It remains to be seen whether they do it, how empowered their officials will be, etc. Very difficult moment inside China right now in the lead up to the 20th People's Congress. So, remains to be seen. But at least you have, on our side, a leader saying we need to be able to control some of these dynamics, and at least there's been a response a positive response on his side for now. So for me, if I take optimism right now, it is the beginning of serious diplomacy around managing this. The underlying structures of interests are very difficult, but at least there's some diplomacy to start managing this, which has been absent for several years.
Thank you. I think we have time for one last question. If there's a final question. Oh, good.
I'm wondering if you might like to talk a little about the Chinese-Russian relationship, which on the surface seems like they would be together in opposing the West, but I'm wondering if there's a deeper level where there might be competition more than cooperation.
Super interesting question. I'm not sure it's going to allow me to end on optimism, but we'll try real hard, okay? I always like to end on an optimistic note. It doesn't always work these days. I put it the same way you do, but I flip it, because it seems to me that when you talk to people who spend a lot of time in the Russia-China relationship, one of the things they'll do is they'll say, look, these guys hate each other. They distrust each other. Both of them, quite frankly, are quite racist about each other. You can hear Chinese saying amazing things about the Russians and vice versa. They have different interests in a whole host of areas. Central Asia is among them. But it seems to me that what we are watching in Central Asia, in the way they are sailing together in the Western Pacific, in the Arctic, in the energy space, in a number of other spaces, is a concert arrangement. Okay, so what tends to happen is we bring to it our mental constructs of like, well, either we like people and we have, we kind of share values with them, and then we'll cooperate and we'll be in an alliance, or we don't, and then we're conflictual. But of course, we didn't used to run the world that way. We used to run them through concerts, which was those of us that were worried about another power would get together to weaken that power, even with people we didn't like much, right? That was the way the world was run for several hundred years. Extremely violent way to run the world, but that's what we did. It seems to me that what the Russians and the Chinese are doing right now are they're running a concert. Okay, they know they don't trust each other. They know they don't like each other. They have an overwhelming interest in breaking NATO, in breaking us. They sense an opportunity. They see weakness in us. They see the tensions between us and the Europeans. They have this sense of an opportunity to break NATO, or at the very least to weaken NATO. It would be profoundly consequential for both of them if they could do that. So I think what we're watching is a very deliberate effort to put aside issues of tension. We've seen it deliberately, explicitly in some energy moves in Central Asia, for example, where they have, we know this through intelligence, have explicitly said, look, we don't agree on this. We'll park it. We're going to come back to this disagreement. But right now we're going to screw the Americans, right? That's a concert, right? And I think what they're doing is running this concert right now until such time as they believe that they have weakened us. Our response is what we've been doing, building up the relations with Japan, Australia, the French, the English, etc. That starts getting real dangerous, two competing concerts. That's where we are. Over time, they don't trust each other. Over time, Russia knows it'll end up being the lesser power in that. But over time, they can also do a lot of damage. So I continue to worry a lot about that relationship. I think we are watching and we'll see more of their cooperation at sea. Russia still has by far the more sophisticated submarine fleet. It's not that big, but it's very sophisticated. China's submarine fleet is not as sophisticated. There's a lot of technology transfer going on there. There's a lot of technology transfer going from China into Russia on AI. Lots of places where they'll find difference of interest, but lots of places where they can focus on weakening us. I think the silver lining, if I put it that way, maybe it's not optimism, but the silver lining is that part of what that has done is it has reinforced a sense in Germany, in India, in Japan, in the Nordic countries, even in Italy of all places, but it's beginning to reinforce a sense that this is not just a question of the Americans being annoying over in Asia and sort of doing stupid things vis-a-vis the Chinese, that we are, as the West, actually confronting something quite worrying. And you're beginning to see a change in attitudes in Berlin and Delhi, et cetera, towards a sense of, no, we really do need to take seriously the challenge posed by both Russia and China and get closer to the U.S. in dealing with that. And I think what we're watching right now is a process by which countries like Germany, countries like India are getting closer to a sense of the need to work with us to constrain what's coming out of Beijing and Moscow right now. And so that's not a kind of a Boolean sense of optimism, but it's a little bit better than we were a few years ago, let's put it that way.
Thank you.